Good morning, Peter Barrett. Joined 12 Squadron in 1982. Was there for about 2.5 years on the Chinook.
My name's Brian Lugg. I joined 12 Squadron in 1985 with Shane and a few others, and I served till 87, and then I flew them again as D models in the Army. This is a D model, but it is one of our original Charlie model aircraft. It's much modified. Gross weight went from 46,000 pounds to 50,000 pounds, and it looks a bit different, but still a lot the same. If you have a look, all of us Charlie model pilots will recognise a lot of the things inside as being Charlie model aircraft parts.
Probably the biggest difference, I guess, between the C model and the D model is this has only got one hook, which is...
Well, this one's got three, but the Charlie had one.
One hook, which was capable of carrying 20,000 pounds, roughly.
It's the same centre hook as the Charlie.
Yeah.
But we have two electric hooks, one front and one aft on this aircraft, which stabilises the load. Some air forces flew them with one pilot and a navigator in the front. The crew in the back depends on whether you're manning all the guns or not. But at least one loadmaster, typically up the front, one flight engineer down the back. He's down the back because the flight engineer's panel is down the back and where all the engine's important bits are.
That's where all the hydraulic oil leaks most of the time.
Yeah, that's right. This one's a little different. The Delta's a little different. The Charlie's leaked like a sieve. The Delta, not so much. The back end still stinks though. You can smell it even now.
Looking at the cockpit in a little more detail, you can see that there's quite a lot of perspex, so the visibility was great. When you're sitting in the pilot seat or the co-pilot seat, this large chin window gave you really good visibility down and out to the sides with the doors, which you could jettison if you had to in an emergency. Interestingly though, one thing that just popped into my mind is when we used to go out and do water landings in the thing, you'd actually put the aircraft into the water and then taxi around on the water, and so you'd be looking down. This bit would be submerged, so you'd be looking down through looking for fish and stuff as you went past. But it's quite a comfortable cockpit actually to fly, and it's lamb's wool seats, a lot better seating than the old Iroquois, so you could spend a lot of time in there and not get fatigued. As far as water landings are concerned, although it's a helicopter and it's got lots of holes in it, they used to bung it up as best they could, but you'd land in water with the ramp up, and you could actually put the thing down and actually taxi around. Special forces overseas used to have a dam affair they'd put across the rear of the cabin, and they could actually launch inflatable boats out the back, which I don't think we ever did. Do you remember doing that? No. But look, even though it was capable of landing in the water, after a while it would fill up, so you'd have to get airborne again before it got too heavy and you couldn't get out, or you'd have to find a nice shallow
like the boat ramp at Muggerah.
Boat ramp to get out, and then you'd undo all the bungs and all the water drain out for half an hour.
The Canadians used to run
The Canadians did, but we didn't. The Canadians had the dam fitted, but the Canadians also had a power down ramp. Because if you're floating in the water and you tried to put the ramp down, it wouldn't go down. It'd just sit there, because ours was a gravity down ramp. It's a big boat underneath. There's a false floor inside, and if you do land it on the water, there's a fair amount of maintenance work that goes on. They've got to pull the floor up and check it out and clean it out. The other thing is though that all the weight's up the top. Even though it's a big flat boat, the weight's up the top. So if the engines stop while you're on the water, it rolls over. This is the Delta that had a different rotor system to the Charlie. The Charlie rotor blade was symmetrical. If you have a look at the end of this blade, it's asymmetrical, okay, which maximises it for lifting in the hover. It does, however, create a lot of problems with vibration in forward flight. And while the V&E on this aircraft and the Charlie was 175 knots, the Charlie would easily get there. This thing at about 150 knots, it's beating you to death. The Charlie was much, much smoother than this aircraft. At high speed, sorry, at high speed. But this one, as I said, because of the asymmetric blades, it lifts a whole lot better. The front has static stops. The back are centrifugal droop stops. The problem with the aft droop stops is if one of the springs breaks, it stays out, and we end up chopping the centre of the aircraft up with one blade as it slows down and droops back towards the aircraft. So one of the differences with the Chinook compared to other conventional helicopters is that normally you would approach a conventional helicopter from the front and stay away from the tail rotor. With this aircraft, you can see the front rotor blade is capable of coming quite low to the ground, and the main entry to this aircraft is down the back through the ramp. You'll notice that the aft rotor is much, much further off the ground, and a nice big ramp out the back to get people in and out. So the main access to the Chinook of whatever variety is to the back.
Hey, good morning. My name is Shane Fairweather. I flew at 12th Squadron from 1985 through to the end of 1988.
I'm Peter Brum Watson. I was in 12th Squadron by July 78 and left at the end of 1980.
So 12th Squadron was my first squadron off parts course, and it was fantastic. Had a really good time. But I think we'll just fill through a few features of the aircraft between Brum and I. And from the back here, you should be able to see that there's an engine on each side, and as we saw earlier, two rotors. And very simply, the way the aircraft works, those two engines go into a gearbox in the middle that combines the power from two engines and sends it forward and aft to drive both rotors.
That dispels one of the misnomers. A lot of people had that one engine drove one rotor and the other engine drove the other rotor, which is not the case, obviously. If one engine quits, you've still got power and so on, etc. And that combining transmission, as they call it in the middle, that the two nose boxes on the engines themselves drove, is about the size of a small bar fridge sort of a deal. And then it drove fore and aft to the front rotor and the back rotor to keep them away from each other, basically synchronised. If they got out of swank, which it did once in Germany and killed a lot of people, the rotors would tie a big knot in the middle, and it was adios amigos.
In fact, there was an interlock. You couldn't start the aircraft if the blades weren't integrated properly.
It was designed that way, I think. They told me at one stage to be able to disconnect the rotors so that they could move them independently to get them into a hangar. It was as simple as that. And I remember at the time of the squadron, we were there when that accident occurred, and those rotors had tied a knot, killed all these paratroopers over in Germany, and they grounded everything, of course, for a while, and they sat and thought about it, and went on for a long time, and they finally came up with a fix that went from a 1/2-inch bolt that held that gearbox in a synchronised fashion to a 3/4-inch bolt. That was their fix. So, and off we went, and it worked ever since that time. But I think what Shane was alluding to before about being a great squadron and stuff like that, that was the best part of this deal. This squadron was probably the best kept secret in the Air Force, and I think Hendo and these other guys will attest to that you just never knew what was going to happen next, you know. It was just a great place for trips turning up out of the blue, and it was just wild and woolly sort of stuff sometimes. Do you ever have anything sort of along those lines happen?
Oh yeah, in many. So it was, you never knew what was going to happen, both on the ground, around the squadron, and in the air. The aircraft had a great skill to throw things at you that you would never have expected. But and let's come back. But just in terms of basics, because a lot of people don't look at a Chinook and say, "How the hell does that thing work?" Igor Sikorsky, who was a helicopter builder and designer, someone asked him probably in the late 70s if he's going to build a tandem rotor helicopter, which the Chinook is. And he said, "Why would I do that when I can't even work out how a single rotor helicopter works?" So aerodynamically, this is very complex. But in simple terms, so in many air shows and public events I went to, people would say to me, "Well, which pilot drives the front rotor and which pilot drives the back rotor?"
Yeah.
So no, it doesn't work that way, and it's actually really quite simple. It makes the aircraft very manoeuvrable. If you look at it, when you want to go forward, the two rotors do that. When you want to slow down, the two rotors do that. If you want to go right, they do that. If you want to go left, and then they can do that. So you can turn it around at any
pivot
around any point. So it was incredibly manoeuvrable for the size of the aircraft. And as Hendo, Luggy said earlier, it was quick. It could do 175 knots.
Yeah.
So for a helicopter is very, very fast. But the complexity of what happens up there, and up in the front of the cockpit is what we used to call the spaghetti cupboard, because
The mixing closet.
Yeah, you have standard helicopter controls for both crews that go into a cupboard in there, and it literally looks like spaghetti with rods and cogs and cams that go up to those two heads to make those rotors do the things I indicated earlier.
I don't know how true it was, but around the squadron at the time, they used to say that the engineers that designed this machine and that the aerodynamicists and so on had very little idea of actually what was going on aerodynamically between those rotors when they intermingled in their turn. They weren't exactly sure what was happening, but it worked, so they kept at it. But yeah, it was just an amazing bit of gear, and also an amazing squadron event at the time. Like I said, it was the best kept secret of the Air Force.
Yeah, one of the really great things about the squadron was it was all the air crew and the ground crew all in together.
Yeah.
And when we deployed, we all worked as one team. And other squadrons I went to later on, that culture didn't exist as we went through. But down the side here are the fuel tanks. There's, like, from memory, long memory, three fuel tanks, about 7,000 pounds. But you'll see here, these are the fuel filler points, and they had to be fueled, gravity fueled, like you'd fuel a car by each point.
No pressure refueling.
No, and it took a while, and I had several occasions flying in New Guinea where we had to hand pump 7,000 pounds of fuel into the aircraft in the stinking heat. It was hot. The squadron had a very good safety record. I wouldn't say they were the most reliable aircraft. They were good when you had them on deployment, when you were flying them a lot, but they were in those days very maintenance intensive and required a lot of effort and a lot of work to keep them flying. But the maintenance crews were fantastic. They never had any lack of confidence in the airworthiness of the aircraft.
I remember
when
that
we took it flying.
One of the Kangaroo exercises. You guys remember up there, the Kangaroo 3 or something? We needed an engine change on the tarmac at Rocky with about 1,000 different other international aircraft around and dust and God knows what. And these guys just turned up. They had an engine flowing in, and these guys were up on those ramps in about 42 degrees heat and changed that bloody engine in just jolly quick time. It's just amazing. Did a great job. They were able to do that kind of thing because they were on side. They were good-natured guys in that.
So along the centre of the aircraft is the main shaft that drives the forward rotor head. Earlier in my day, I got to have a look at one of those shafts. It's about 2.5 millimetres thick, the metal around the outside, and it's and it's driving enough torque to lift over 40,000 pounds.
Shane was talking about this gravity feed fuel. There was one of our crewies, and that would do the refueling, and was just parked on the tarmac at Richmond. So if you imagine, he's standing here like this with his hose stuck in there, and normally they'd have a little ladder to get up and look down to see how it was going, and Bongo Morrison was doing it, right? So there was no ladder, and he didn't bother, so he was just pumping it up, and it just filled and filled and filled, got to the top, blew back, hit him in the face. He wound up in Richmond Base Hospital there for about 3 days. I was doing a trip out of Richmond, and if that cowling that's open now gets a bit deformed on the C model, the engine condition lever that turns the engine and could get caught in the cowling, it wouldn't go into the flight mode. It'd come back all right. And I had an aircraft full of passengers with the flight engineer up on that stand, bashing that panel with a rubber mallet, saying, "Try now, try now." Did you ever have any emergencies on this? Yeah, I had a couple. I had one going in, it was Gladstone late in the afternoon, and up in the back there, we didn't know what it was, but it looked like somebody had a grinding wheel up in the, going off up in that pylon up there. It was just sparks and stuff going everywhere. So we landed on a school oval in the middle of footy practice. They got the idea pretty quickly and got out of the way. And it turned out to be buried in a generator that had given up the ghost and was slowly melting and grinding itself to death.
But anything happens up there, you get on the ground as quickly as you could, and that was the great thing about a helicopter. You know, you
can land anywhere.
You can land.
Arriving at that squadron, I came out of SAR flight. I'd been to the Sinai, and they didn't know what to do with us. And Jeff Watson and I were at SAR flight in Williamtown for a few months, and then this job came up in 12 Squadron. Do you want to go? Yeah, why not? Ugliest aeroplane on the planet, but what the hell? NES. We went up there, and it was just for 2.5 years. It was just outstanding. But the thing about it was, like I said, on an average squadron, like if you instructed at Pierce or something, you'd go to work in the morning, you didn't know what you were going to get that day and what you were going to be doing. Most squadrons were like that, I think, the knuckleheads, etc. Same thing. You'd have a fair idea what was going to happen. In this outfit, you had no idea what was going to happen. And the classic was, one Friday morning I went there was nothing much on. We used to have a Friday afternoon barbecue, I think, didn't we, out the side of the building. And by 4 o'clock, we were loaded up and heading to New Guinea to go to Carcar Island because it had blown up and we had to evacuate the place. And there were bloody hercs and all sorts of stuff going on. That sort of thing could happen, you know, out of nothing. Next thing you know, you had a 2-week bloody mission on sort of thing, and it was outstanding in that regard. We picked up 100-foot power poles at Morton Island, dropped them into holes in the ground with about an 8-inch give on either side, and guys with ropes to guide them down. The crews did an amazing job. Just like we were talking about the hooks before, there was only one hook in the hellhole, and the boys were there, these 100-foot bloody poles, and dropping them into these holes in the ground. I think Scipio Dwyer was flying when they went and picked the carriages off the side of the Blue Mountains after that came off the rails up there in the hills. Yeah, at Glenbrook, yeah, picking up trains off tracks and stuff on the sides of hills.
You know, I did things like, you know, routine operations, SAR, search and rescue, pulling people off tops of mountains, putting poles up, antennas up, flying prime ministers, feeding sheep in floods, picking up
boats. Yeah, boats. Yeah.
Picking up boats. And as Brum said, you know, I remember I got married in 1987. I think I was only home for 3 months of that year. And yes. Most of it was never planned. You just go to work and one day you're off somewhere. And particularly flying in New Guinea, whilst it was challenging, it was amazing. And Brum spoke about Carcar Island. We always went to Carcar to practice. And you know, this is just an idea of the sort of variety we did. We had to put some volcanologists into the crater.
That's right.
So the crater's about a mile across and it's about 1,000 feet deep. So we dropped this crew in on top of this rock, and they said, well, it'll be about 20 minutes. So we flew around and we couldn't find them when we got back. Just couldn't find them. Hell, what are we going to do? And it wasn't until we realised that we actually put them on a rock as big as this hangar, and that we were looking for big people on a rock. Once we realised we were looking for small people on a massive rock, we found them okay and got them out of there. But you know, that was just spectacular to do that sort of thing.
We were doing the same thing actually. We went up there, it was almost identical. We were up there just after it had blown. And they said, you know, the volcano had blown, you know, days previous or something like that. And we got up there and we were looking around the rim of this thing. And they said there was some volcanologists, we lost them sort of thing. Oh, where were they sort of thing? And they said, over there. And the edge of this volcano had this big gap in it, a big hole, and that's where it had gone out. And these guys went with it. That was the end of that. But yeah, we're flogging around inside that thing and you could smell the damn sulphur in that, eh?
Oh, yeah,
it was bloody awful. You wondered the thing could still operate in that air. But it was really, really an interesting sort of a aircraft to work on for the sort of things that you did. It was amazing.
Yeah, and flying in New Guinea, it was challenging, particularly high altitudes. The air gets less dense and you don't generate as much power from the engines or the rotors. So you know, the aircraft has amazing single engine performance down at these sort of altitudes, but at high altitude it's still pretty good. You can fly away, but at the really high altitudes, often you drift down height. The height at which you could hold was below ground level, so you had to be really, really careful. So, you know, whilst it was a really capable aircraft, in a normal operating environment, New Guinea really, really challenged. And because it was so powerful, we could operate above 10,000 feet, which meant we had to operate in oxygen. So we would take portable oxygen bottles and to operate those high altitudes. So it was a really exciting aircraft to fly.
Well, the capability of it too, the things it could lift, like a Caribou sputtered in at Telefomin. They pranged it on the strip there and they had to pull the wings off and stuff. And we went up there, I think it was Chris Beattie and myself, picked this thing up and hauled it back down to Moresby or wherever. There was another job at some time after where we picked up a 1936 tri-motor, which is an old World War II thing sitting up on the range there. We picked that up and hauled that down to Moresby. It's in a museum at Moresby now, I believe. Just jobs like that out of the blue, you know, because of the capability of the aircraft and our availability. We just got involved in so many different things. The trip to Malaysia was, at the time, a record breaker, they said, you know, to fly from Amberley all the way up through to Butterworth and beyond, up into the jungle there and pick up one of the Malaysian choppers that had sputtered into the jungle, got it out, and then, of course, when we got there, wow, look at this thing, we can do lots of stuff. So we started to pick up all these other jobs around the place, picking up wreckage of aircraft and that all around Butterworth.
We did one job in New Guinea where we right up into the sort of Western Highlands that had not seen much in the way of white civilization, and we had to deliver a big bulldozer and 3 lifts up there because they'd found a lot of gold. So the first lift we did, they were throwing spears at us as we came in, and we dropped off an interpreter, and I thought that's the bravest man on the planet. And then by the time we came back, the second lift that was all a bit quieter. And the third lift, we arrived, and because we had to land to pick up the interpreter, they've killed several pigs and are all in their good gear. And
It was a party.
Yeah, it was, and the interpreter says the chief's invited you to lunch. I go, I'm not shutting the helicopter down up here. So he said, he's killed 4 of his pigs. He's going to lose great face.
Did you get it to go, mate, one of those little styrene packs? No?
So I thought, oh, okay. I said, go and ask him in front of everybody to come for a fly with us. And so he couldn't refuse. So he jumps in, and we get airborne. He's sitting looking out that door. It was pretty comfy because that was the same view out of his house up in the Highlands. We flew around a bit, and the crew took him down to look through the hook hole. That's the point at which he realised
he was airborne.
And he was really scared. He was terrified. So anyway, we got him back up the front. We landed and got him out, and the whole tribe rushed up to him and around him. The interpreter got in and said, "Let's go. He's going to be, he and his sons, his grandsons, his great grandsons are going to be chief forever, because as far as they're concerned, he's been one of the gods."
Yeah.
And in fact, in Papuan, in Pidgin English, they used to call the Chinook the Mixmaster Belonga Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the flight engineer's end of the aeroplane. Both engines, there's one just outside there and another one on the other side there, and the main aft transmission is directly above my head underneath all these panels. Just slightly at the back there, you'll see the auxiliary power unit that's basically provides us with hydraulic power and electrical power while the main engines aren't running. The reason it's the flight engineer's end of the aeroplane is the flight engineer's panel down the back here that monitors all the hydraulic pressures, also the transmission chip detectors. Basically those chip detectors will tell us if there's any loose metal running around the transmissions. That's never a good thing for any helicopter. The big handle that you see here is how we pump up the accumulator for the APU if we need to. The Charlie model had exactly the same. It's a hydraulic start for the auxiliary power unit. More modern helicopters actually have a nice little electric motor that does that for us without any effort. Interesting feature for the Chinook, the Charlie model had the same. We can actually put hydraulic fluid into the systems in flight, so we can top it up, pump it up with its little handle, and if we start losing hydraulic fluid through a leak, we can actually top it up while you're in flight. Everything in the airplane as far as controls are concerned are hydraulics, so losing hydraulic fluid again is a pretty severe outcome. Above my head here is mainly hydraulics, all the various hydraulic systems. We have 2 major hydraulic systems on the aircraft that keep the flight controls going. A few other bits and pieces you can see down the side here are little stands that go under the ramp to hold it up off the ground if you want to do some maintenance, or when you have to load something directly straight into the aircraft. The ramp controls are here, so the flight engineer again can drive the ramp up or down. Both in this model and in the Charlie, the ramp is hydraulically powered up, and then it is locked in place once it's up. But when you want to put it down, it's gravity only down. So when you take it to down, the locks are pulled out and the ramp just falls down below you. When I visited the factory when these aircraft were being revamped into Delta models, they had a rack of ramps in the factory, and a whole bunch of ramps had blue pencil marks and texture marks around all these holes in the ramps, and the ramps on the other end were all shiny and pristine and clean and tidy. And I said, oh, that's those ramps that you've got over there, they're obviously the ones that you've repaired. And they went, no, they're yours. They're the ones off your aircraft. And they were pristine, they were lovely.
So here we are in the cockpit. Hendo sitting in the captain's seat and me in the co-pilot seat. The flight instruments are essentially duplicated on both sides, which was great, instead of having to look from one side across to the other, which is moderately like that in the Iroquois. But this, you could actually concentrate on your primary flight instruments and rotor RPM, engine, some of the engine parameters here, and then while the other pilot who was not flying could do the radios or whatever else. So moving across from left to right, if you like, as I said, flight instruments here in this section here, which is a bit difficult to see, but this is the caution panel. Each pilot's got a master caution light above, which would illuminate if something happened down here, just to draw your attention to whatever the issue was, and then you would deal with it.
Usually the caution light will illuminate if any of the aircraft systems are out of normal operating limits, and the master caution is right in the middle of your view, so it alerts you to the fact that one of the lights is illuminated. Next to that we have all the engine instruments and transmission instruments, which gives you temperatures and pressures, and there are selector switches which allow you to check each engine and each transmission individually. Working our way down, there's radio equipment.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, and up here above are the fire warning handles, and if there is a fire in either of the engines, they will illuminate, and you can then isolate that engine, shut it down, and fire a fire extinguisher into the engine that's on fire.
And that was I might got to say, having come out of Iroquois, which is what I started on, one, having two engines was great, but also having fire handles that you could actually had the option of trying to put the fire out, which was even better too, instead of having to descend with flames and things coming out of the back of the engine.
Also, you can divert both of the fire bottles into the one engine, so if the first fire bottle doesn't put the fire out, you can switch it to the other fire bottle and fire that into the engines. Down below here is mostly radios. In the C model Chinook, used to have the engine condition levers, which I guess you'd refer to as the throttles, down here, but they're now being replaced and moved up to the overhead panel up here. Also up here, we've got some lights. We can operate red and green lights in the back of the aircraft to alert troops to certain conditions, in particular for parachuting. One incident that occurred, I was a junior pilot on the Squadron, just arrived, and I had a senior squadron leader flying as the captain, and he told me to fly the aircraft and he'd look after the lights, and I was flying along there, we were coming up to the drop zone, and I said red on, so he put the red on, that indicated to the paratroopers they were about to jump, and then I said green on, and he flicked it back to the centre position, which turned all the lights off. And I looked in the rear view mirror, which is here, and you can see out the back, and I saw that the paratroopers weren't jumping. And I looked up at the switch and realised it was in the centre position, and I said to him, you didn't put the green on. And so immediately he reached up and put the green on, but by this time we were past the drop zone, and we dropped about half a dozen paratroopers into backyards in Watsonia down in Melbourne, and there was paratroopers landing on hills hoists and all sorts of things.
It appears to be a fairly complicated cockpit for a 2-engine sort of helicopter, but once you got used to it, it was actually fairly easy to operate and to move around. And we're just sitting here, both of us, when we jumped back in, we sunk into the lamb's wool covered seats, and you just took me back.
It's like coming home.
Coming home, yeah, they're very comfortable seats to sit in.
Yeah. And there's also windows here which you can open and shut. And because air is flowing past the outside, it creates a low pressure area outside the window. So the air in the aircraft comes from the cabin behind us into the cockpit and out the side windows. And quite often people in riding in the Chinook would get airsick and start vomiting, and if that happened, you immediately shut these windows to stop all that air in the back from coming up and getting into the cockpit.
Just reminded me of something that happened to me. I hadn't been on the Squadron for that long, and we went flying across to Western Australia for, I think it was exercise Kangaroo 83. So most of the Air Force deployed to Roebourne, which is in the middle of nowhere. And we were crossing over from probably Mount Isa, somewhere across the Northern Territory. And I was navigating, so I had my map all folded up here, navigating. Unfortunately, I got it too close to the window, and it disappeared.
Sucked out the window.
So that was the end of my map.
That's happened more than once on the Squadron. Yeah. I was night flying one night with a junior officer, and he was navigating. He had his wander light, and here's the wander light up here, which is used at night time for reading your maps. And I asked him, where are we? And he said, well, I don't know. I said, well, get your wander light and look at your map. And he said, I can't. I said, why? He said, well, my wander light got sucked out the window, and even though it's on a cord, he couldn't pull it back in because it had wrapped around the HF antenna. So we had to land and unwrap it from the HF antenna and bring it back inside. The Chinook, when it's on the ground on all four wheels, can be steered by unlocking the rear wheels, and we've got a hydraulic control which allows us to turn one of the back wheels and actually drive it on the ground like a car. So the rotors are tilted forward enough to actually produce a forward thrust, and then it rolls on the ground, and we just use that to control the direction we go on the ground. If we're going to do a running landing, we actually lock those rear wheels so they can't turn. Otherwise it'd be like being on casters and you'd be all over the place.
So that's locked. That's unlocked, in which case they're castering, and that is engaging the steering. It's very effective, but until you get used to it, it can swing the back out fairly quickly. So you've got to think about where the back is going rather than kind of where the
it's not like a car where your front wheels steer. It's more like a forklift where your back wheels are the steering wheels. But the seats are probably one of the most comfortable seats in the Air Force.
Yep, I reckon.
Probably only equalled by the Hercules. They're very soft, got lamb's wool seat covers, beautiful view. Actually, I had an epiphany one day. We were flying down along the New South Wales coast, and a co-pilot was flying. I had a cup of coffee, and we were about 50 feet above the surf going down the coast, and we had the sun coming in through the top windows, and I looked down through the bottom windows and there were dolphins jumping through crystal clear water, and I said to myself, well, if this isn't the best way to earn a living, well, there isn't a better one.
Yeah. And that's one of the great things about flying helicopters. You went to all sorts of really interesting places. It was busy, but there was always something different going on, wasn't there?
You can be on an exercise and be tasked to go and do one job, and halfway through that, you'll get called up and say, when you finish that, go and do something else.
The other great thing about the Chinook, which we might talk about later, is how much party gear you can stick in the back if you were going on an exercise. You know,
Yeah.
the poor army would be out there living in foxholes and in dirt and stuff, and we'd turn up and drive our little short wheelbase Land Cruiser off the back with a trailer full of refrigerators, generators, party lights, VCRs and TVs.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But probably 12 Squadron and 9 Squadron, the Iroquois Squadron, spent probably more time with the Army than they did with the Air Force.
Yep.
Because unlike the Hercules and the fighter pilots and the maritime pilots who go and live in 5-star hotels, we go and live under 1,000,000 stars because we camp out in the bush with the Army.
I used to feel really sorry, both on the Iroquois and on the Chinook. You feel really sorry when you'd land out in the scrub and the poor grunts, as we used to call them, would come up and jump in the back of the Iroquois, this thing, and they just smelt like rotting sandbags because they'd been out in the scrub for like 3 weeks without a shower, and they just looked like death. Yeah. But we used to support them quite a bit. We'd take out sort of hot meals for them for when we could for evening meals. The Army used to try to get a hot meal to the troops in the field at least once a day, which was a big morale boost for them, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, probably the Army unit we had most to do with and were good friends with was 9 Pet Platoon, who provided the fuel for us when we were in the field. These guys would refuel us day and night, and because of the Chinook's great downwash, they'd get covered in dirt and dust. I can always remember them taking their goggles off and there's just this big mark around their eyes where there's no dust and the rest is covered in crap. So whenever we had any soft drinks or stuff, they were always welcome to it, free of charge. They did a great job. One other thing about the Chinook is we used to do hot refuels where we would keep the rotors running and these guys would run out and refuel the aircraft while the aircraft was still running, which minimised the amount of time to get the aircraft refueled, and then as soon as they were finished they'd lock the caps and we'd be away to do more whatever we were doing. We spent a lot of time lifting artillery, didn't we?
Yeah, and look, and that's one of the reasons I think that the Chinook was brought back into service, is when they decided it was too expensive to run and they kind of mothballed them. They were really trying to sell them, but then they realised that the Black Hawk couldn't lift the artillery the way the old Chinook could, even the Charlie model with the single hook, because it'd pick up a gun, I think, and
pick up 3 guns.
3 guns or
3 A22 bags which held the ammunition and just 3 crews inside.
Yeah, and just drop the whole lot on the new artillery position for them instead of having to do it in multiple lifts. So you could get in and out a lot more quickly, and that's why one of the reasons they brought the thing back, I think.
Yeah, one of the other things we used to do was move an artillery battery from one location to another while the battery was firing. So the battery would be there firing away and one of the guns had shut down and pack up ready to be lifted, and the Chinook would come in while the other guns were firing, pick up that one gun, move it, and then he'd set up at the new base, fire support base, and start firing while we moved the other guns. So you could keep fire onto one target and actually move the location of the battery so the enemy couldn't do any counter battery fire.